Tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me alone to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Whenever I go.
Don't let these placid, serene scenes fool you. We all know that appearances can be deceiving. At any one time, the settlement at the mouth of the Moira River was a political hotbed where the reformers challenged the establishment. It was a railway town, it was a lumbering town, and for a time it even suffered from gold fever. For 3 decades, it was home to Susanna Moody, and she loved and hated it simultaneously. For a while, during Prohibition to be exact, enough booze flowed out of this place to drown the whole American shore of Lake Ontario. Well, as I said, appearances can be deceiving, so come along with us now and I'll show you what I mean about the city of Belleville. A farmer's market, City Hall, things intersecting.
Lower could be a. You can do a quarter roll with the kitty back roll. Cross the ankles. Up, up. Up, up. And up.
The present, the past.
You know, life here wasn't all lumbering, and it wasn't all of these things. We had a very, we had a very varied existence. This was a pioneer community.
65 years ago, the 2 major industries in the Belleville area were the railroads and Corby Weiser Distillery, which was producing some 50,000 gallons of this amber-colored liquid each month. 80% of this production was being exported illegally to the United States.
Arts and politics of the last century. Susanna and Dunbar Moody.
They moved from the difficulties of the bush into what they thought would be the sanctuary of a flourishing, thriving small town, only to find that they had entered a hornet's nest of political unrest.
I think you describe Belleville as having its origins as really a rough, rousing, somewhat bawdy, lumbering community and farming community.
Factors of influence. The surrounding landscape of Hastings and Prince Edward counties, supporting agriculture. The Canadian Shield to the north with its resources of timber and minerals. The Bay of Quinte and the river that runs into it. All have played a part in shaping the place. Some continue. Author and historian Jerry Boyce.
Belleville is at the mouth of the Moira River, which is a fairly fast-flowing river, especially in the spring, which flows from the northern sections of Hastings County with various tributaries and enters the Bay of Quinte. The beginnings of Belleville go back, I suppose, to Indian times, when the native peoples actually had a small settlement. The earliest settlers who would have come in would be the Loyalists, and they had been farmers in many cases in the 13 colonies, They were looking for really the same kind of life which they had left when they'd been forced out. So the farming was a major industry.
What town do we live in?
Bellville!
That's right, that's right. And did you ever wonder sometimes how certain things got their names?
Yeah.
For instance, we have a very popular spot here in Belleville called Myers Pier, and that was named after a gentleman by the name of Captain Myers. Well,
Andy Forgay's approach to history has a twist.
and I think you might already know it. And so if we sing this song, we'll know just a little bit more about some of the historical figures from Belleville. Here we go. Oh, Captain Myers, Susie Moo, and Sir Mackenzie Bull, they all lived in my hometown. I thought you'd like to know. Oh, Captain Myers, Susie Moo, and Sir Mackenzie Bull, they all lived in my hometown. I thought you'd like to know.
Well, it was in 1790 that Captain John Myers harnessed water power and christened the place Myers Creek. Soon immigration and the settling of the Lake Ontario front would impact on the new community.
We had many people who arrived in the 1830s who really played a major role. William Hutton, who became the first warden, for instance, for Hastings County. 1839, Susanna Moody and Dunbar Moody, her husband, arrived. He is the first sheriff, and she is his wife, and I guess you'd say resident writer.
The Moodys moved to this cottage on West Bridge Street following 6 years in what Susanna called the Green Prison of the Woods. Life in the Clearings, a story whose characters are ideas and values, would follow the better-known Roughing It in the Bush. Michael Peterman.
We have few classics, as it were, in early Canadian writing, in 19th century Canadian writing, and this is certainly one of them. This is a book that most students are reading, that most people know something about. She wrote a powerfully autobiographical book about her experiences because she let her emotions come out. I think this phrase comes directly from Roughing It in the Bush. This was the great epoch of their lives.
The epoch would prove to be bittersweet. Politics heated up soon after the Moodys' arrival.
Chasse. Strong. And strong. Good.
The Quinte Ballet School, making its way on the national scene for over 2 decades, an integral part of Belleville life. The mid-1800s.
Susanna, when she arrived, would have found a very rapidly growing community because in the 2 decades, the 1840s and 1850s, the population doubled. Rapid population growth and the expansion of the town. Many businesses opened up in the years leading up to Confederation. It was a period of great optimism. You have the railroads, you have the industries, you have the opening of mining in Center Hastings, copper mines, lead mines. And Belleville is really in the center of a fairly fertile agricultural area.
Frontiers were also spawning grounds for certain ideals in social democracy. In the Canadas, the rebellion of 1837 had uprooted the Tory establishment, the family compact, by seeking reform, government by representation. Belleville changed Susanna and Dunbar.
The country around Belleville was largely reformist in its sympathies, whereas the town of Belleville, and certainly the lawyers of Belleville, were largely, the political operations of Belleville were largely Tory. The Moodys, of course, came down thinking of themselves, I think, as Tories, or at least in 1839 they thought of themselves as loyal and conservative English folk who would always have supported the government. And so it's interesting that she and her husband, at some point about that fulcrum moment in 1840 when they moved to Belleville, they became reformist sympathizers. And she and her husband both committed themselves more or less publicly to that stance and angered a great number of people in Belleville, which was largely a Tory community.
The history of this century here maintained its rough and tumble character. Take the era of prohibition, for example. Bill Hunt.
One of the most successful, in terms of not getting caught, bootleggers in the area was a man by the name of Harry Ketchison. He bought a special boat, a boat that was low enough to go under the Bay Bridge and over to the Belleville docks, where he would load it up with Corby's whiskey. And ostensibly, he was going to take this Corby's whiskey to Mexico or Cuba or someplace like that. In actual fact, he would sail out and down to his farm and unload the whiskey there, hide it away in his barn, where the police were never able to find it, and then distribute it to his many customers in the rural area around. These people were, in some cases, risk takers by preference. Ben Kerr was a man who pushed it to the limit, who obviously enjoyed the physical danger aspect. There are also people who clearly felt the law was something which could be ignored. I was breaking no law if I was a liquor exporter, until I got into the United States, and then I was breaking their laws.
Well, as I said, appearances can be deceiving. A lake port, a stopover for stagecoaches traveling the Kingston Road. The East Central Ontario location has factored in Belleville's growth.
Within a few years after Susanna's arrival in town, transportation had taken on an entirely different look. In 1856, the Grand Trunk, reaching from Toronto to Montreal and passing through Belleville with the first train in October of that year. And Belleville became a divisional point on the railroad, because now you had the trains coming in from the east and from the west, and there were railroads going north to the iron and the gold and other mining regions in center and North Hastings. So Belleville was sort of a railroad hub.
And still, transportation influences everyday life. The 10-acre truck stop. One of the largest in North America. It plays host to the jockeys of the industry. Facilities connected to transportation.
That's fine.
Integrated into life here since 1870, the Ontario School for the Deaf, Belleville. Originally serving a province-wide need, access by rail was the deciding factor in locating the facility here. The school has an enrollment of about 150 resident and non-resident students today. A gateway to the north.
Mining has always been important in Belleville and Hastings County. And in 1866, in August, at a little place called, now at least called El Dorado, gold was discovered on the John Richardson farm by a gentleman, Marcus Powell, who was prospecting for copper. And it took some time before they realized that the copper they thought they had found was really gold. And the route of getting to the gold fields was, of course, through Belleville. So there was a great deal of activity here. People from Boston, people from Chicago, investors from San Francisco, from Australia, from the British Columbia mining fields, all pouring in through Belleville to the gold fields back at El Dorado.
Once editor and owner of the local newspaper, Mackenzie Bowell would enter politics and go on to become Canada's 5th Prime Minister, 1894 to 96. Bowell had apprenticed under George Benjamin, the paper's founder, and a rival of the Moodys.
He was an English-born Jew who came to Belleville via the southern United States, where he married a very young woman. He tried to hide his Jewishness as much as he could. I guess politically thought it was best to just be George Benjamin, Englishman in Belleville. But he started the first Belleville newspaper, which is in fact the ongoing solid newspaper of Belleville, the Belleville Intelligencer. And his own interests were Tory, largely, and he was very interested in the Orange Order. When the Moodys arrived, he quickly became their political enemy as the writer of the Intelligencer, which was the Tory organ of the day. He used the newspaper to heap scorn, criticism, villainy upon Dunbar Moody, John Moody as sheriff. But Benjamin earned the hatred of Susanna Moody. I don't think, I mean, she was amused by him to some extent, but she just hated him, I think, for what he had done.
The arts, the rhythm of life, industry. Life along the Moira River and the Bay of Quinte has been centered on industry. Beginning with John Myers in the 18th century, the river has begotten dynasties.
Bill of Flint was the lumber merchant most remembered as far as Belleville's concerned. He was a speculator, he was an investor, he was a temperance advocate, he was a churchman, he established the first Sunday school in Belleville, and Bill of Flint played, among other things, a role as a temperance person.
Temperance. When it won over in the U.S., creating prohibition from 1920 to 1933, Henry Corby, a Belleville baker cum distillery owner, capitalized on local resources to supply a dry population in the millions just across the lake.
But as a consequence of this huge demand in the United States for Canadian whiskey, Corby's, which had been producing 500 gallons a month in the early 1920s, within a few years had increased its production through a massive capital expenditure to 50,000 gallons a month. And the man responsible for this was Harry Hatch, who had been recruited by the owner of Corby's to be its sales manager. And they put together an army, or I should say a navy, of rum-running boats and officers and men. Probably one of the most fascinating rum runners was Benjamin Kerr, who was an entrepreneur. He was a plumber by trade and a boat builder, but primarily he was a rum runner, and was one of the few rum runners to run loads across Lake Ontario all winter long, regardless of the weather. This was a very hazardous business after the 15th of December. So after that date, a rum runner didn't have to worry about being captured by the Coast Guard, but he did have to worry a great deal about the lake. And in fact, that's what finally did in Ben Kerr. The boat blew up. We don't know exactly what happened. There's still a mystery. Some people think he was hijacked. Parts of the boat were found washed up on the beach, charred and burned, even though this was in midwinter.
Storytelling. Life in the clearings. The life of the Moodys.
Well, I think the earliest years in Belleville were very difficult for them, and perhaps those scars remain throughout her writing. You'll see manifestations of it, little ripples of it. It was partly the political polarity, polarization that they were caught in the middle of. That was very difficult for them. They had the house, their first house burned down. Then in 1844, her beloved child, John, named, of course, after her husband, born in the backwoods, drowned in the Moira River in the spring of 1844. He'd been fishing with his two older brothers, and I think the story goes, that, as it later emerges, that he tried to come home to show his mother a fish he'd caught, slipped on a dock, and fell into the river. The Moira, of course, is a raging river in the spring.
Long, weary months have passed since that sad day, but naught beguiles my bosom of its sorrow. Susanna Moody. Yet the river that gave life, took life away, continues to spawn evolving ideals.
Now once upon a time, by a little bay, a man named Captain Myers came to town one day. He took a look around and he thought he'd like to stay. And from that little settlement grew what we have today. Oh, Captain Myers, Susie Moo, and Sir Mackenzie Bull, they all lived in my hometown. I thought you'd like to know.
A past remembered.
Susanna's letters, which are in Letters of a Lifetime, her letters describing their later years together, are really quite charming. She says that they, in effect, were never happier, in a sense, with what little they had because they were together. Life is a struggle. It was a struggle for them always, socially, in terms of their desire for a religious purchase on things, in terms of economics. It's a very sad thing to see this elderly couple without income, without very much support. The path, as it were, was never clear. So the struggle defines the life, in a sense, as it does, I guess, for us today.
Dunbar died in 1869, Susanna in 1885. The cottage on West Bridge Street still stands, a house from which they watched the evolution of a city.
You really have a community which has been a slowly growing community. It hasn't grown as large and it hasn't grown as fast as many communities in Canada have. But yet it has maintained a slow and steady growth, and it's been able to preserve, as I've said, some of the best features of the past at the same time as it's moved into new technologies today.
Things intersecting. A river and a lake, urban and rural, past and present. Ideas and ideals. This is Bellville, Ontario.